The village of Morton Chase had always worn its quiet like a shroud, concealing stories better left unspoken. On a damp autumn morning, the mist clung low to the hedgerows, and the familiar hum of daily life felt oddly muted. At Ivy Banks, Miss Marple sat by the window, knitting with her usual calm, yet her sharp eyes caught something unusual: the postman's hurried step, a letter clutched tightly in his hand, pale and creased. Letitia, her cousin, was already awake, stirring tea in the kitchen. When Miss Marple showed her the letter, the faintest shadow crossed Letitia's face, a flicker of old unease. The envelope bore no return address, only a name: Edith Vale. A name whispered often in the village, yet spoken cautiously, as if it carried a weight too heavy for ordinary conversation. Miss Marple's curiosity was quietly piqued. Who was Edith Vale? And why did this letter seem to carry a silence louder than any words? Outside, the morning unfolded with its familiar routines, but inside Ivy Banks, something had shifted. A secret, long buried, was beginning to stir. The morning wore on, heavy with unspoken questions. Miss Marple's fingers paused in their rhythm as she studied the envelope again, her mind threading through memories she scarcely realized she kept. Edith Vale was not a name she heard often, not in the bustling market, nor the church gatherings. Yet there was a silence around it, as if the name itself was a careful refrain in a forgotten song. Letitia moved about the room, placing a delicate porcelain cup before her cousin. "Do you remember her, Jane?" she asked quietly, her voice hesitant. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Vaguely. She lived at Vale House, just beyond the edge of the village. A private woman, shrouded in stories that never fully surfaced. Some said she was kind, others whispered of sorrow, of things left undone." The letter, now carefully unfolded, revealed only a few lines, brief, measured, but carrying a weight that seemed to stretch beyond ink and paper. A plea, a confession veiled in gentleness, and a hint at something lost. That afternoon, with the letter folded into her pocket, Miss Marple set out for Vale House, a place she had avoided for years, not out of fear, but respect for the shadows that clung to its walls. As she approached, the fading light caught the ivy that had overtaken the gate, and the windows reflected the somber sky, like eyes that refused to meet. There, in the stillness of the approaching dusk, Miss Marple sensed the first stirrings of a story that would unravel quietly, but with a depth that would touch every corner of Morton Chase. Vale House stood silent beneath a gathering sky, its heavy wooden door marked by the faint traces of years untouched. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, noting the slight creak of the gate hinge behind her, a sound more from habit than disturbance. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. She was met not by the lady of the house, but by Miss Benton, the schoolteacher, whose eyes flickered with a mix of caution and something softer, regret, perhaps. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, as though the walls themselves listened. "We weren't expecting visitors." "I came on behalf of Edith," Miss Marple replied gently. "I have something she left behind, something she wanted found." Miss Benton's hands trembled slightly as she took the letter. Edith always kept things close, things people might not understand. Miss Marple nodded, folding her hands. Sometimes the silence between words speaks loudest. Their conversation was interrupted by the soft footsteps of Letitia, who had quietly arrived to join them. Together, the three women lingered in the shadowed parlor, where faded portraits watched from the walls, their eyes heavy with untold stories. It was here, among the dust-laden shelves and muted light, that Miss Marple noticed a small, leather-bound sketchbook resting beneath a faded silk cloth. She lifted it gently, feeling the weight of unspoken confessions between its pages. "Edith's drawings," Miss Benton whispered, voice barely audible. She never spoke of them, but they held her heart. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple began to turn the pages, each sketch more haunting than the last. Faces half-remembered, scenes blurred by sorrow, shadows dancing in charcoal and ink. The past was speaking, softly, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. The days grew shorter, and the village seemed wrapped in a quiet anticipation that only Miss Marple could sense. The sketchbook, now resting safely on her lap, revealed more with each turn of its delicate pages, a language of shadows and light, sorrow and longing. One drawing lingered longer in her thoughts. A figure, a woman standing by a window, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on some distant horizon. The charcoal lines trembled with a fragile hope, a yearning that time had not yet silenced. Miss Marple sought out those who might know more. Madge Pym, the midwife turned recluse, answered her questions with reluctant sighs and half-remembered tales. Edith was no stranger to grief, she said, voice low. But there was always a strength in her, something fierce beneath that quiet. In the marketplace, whispers spoke of a brother, Robert Gale, who had vanished after the war, changed in name and place, but not in the memory of those who loved him. Edith's letters, now pieced together, hinted at a reunion shadowed by fear and secrecy. Back at Vale House, Miss Benton revealed her own hesitations. Edith wanted to protect him, not just from the world, but from the past. She hid the truth in her art and her silence. Jane understood then that this was not simply a tale of lost family, but of wounds too deep for words, and the delicate threads of forgiveness tangled between them. As the autumn wind swept through the village, Miss Marple realized the past was not buried, only waiting, patiently, to be uncovered. The village seemed to hold its breath under a heavy sky, as if even the clouds sensed the weight of the unspoken histories threading through Morton Chase. Miss Marple felt it too, the fragile tension between what was remembered and what was carefully forgotten, hanging over the worn cobblestones and peeling paint of Vale House like a shroud. Her footsteps echoed softly as she made her way to the solicitor's modest office, tucked away above the grocer's shop. The scent of aged paper and ink greeted her before the nervous clerk looked up from his ledgers, eyes darting with a mixture of curiosity and unease. He was a man used to routine, yet something in Miss Marple's calm inquiry seemed to unsettle the quiet order of his days. "Miss Vale's will," she began gently, folding her hands atop the counter. "I understand there was a revision made not long before her passing?" The clerk swallowed, then nodded, as if the words were a key to a door he wished remained closed. "Yes, quite unusual. Some clauses were removed, others added in what seemed a rather sudden fashion. There was mention of a bequest held in reserve, conditional, I believe." "Conditional?" Miss Marple's voice was soft but carried the weight of her curiosity. "Might I ask to whom that bequest was intended?" The man hesitated, glancing toward the dim window as if the answer might escape through the glass. "Officially, it was all Miss Vale's decision," he said carefully. "But there were whispers that someone from her past had persuaded her to make these changes, someone she hoped to protect, or perhaps hide." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, her mind assembling pieces of a puzzle that refused to be complete. The idea of protection and secrecy had a familiar ring. She had seen how often the past clung to the living, not with violence, but with silence and omission. As she turned to leave, the clerk added, almost as an afterthought, "It's a curious thing, Miss Marple. Legal documents are meant to be precise, but sometimes they conceal as much as they reveal." Outside, the late afternoon light had softened, casting long shadows across the village square. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and faded roses. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Letitia, who awaited her at Ivy Banks, poring over old letters with furrowed brows and a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights. "There was a woman," Letitia said quietly, her voice threading through the stillness. "She came to Vale House once, a visitor, pale and withdrawn. No one knew her name. She was there for but a brief moment, almost like a ghost passing through." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "A ghost with no name," she murmured. "It is often the forgotten voices that hold the deepest truths." The village, with all its gossip and rituals, had been keeping its secrets well. Yet beneath the quiet surfaces, Miss Marple could feel the slow weaving of a tapestry, threads of fear, regret, and perhaps the fragile hope of forgiveness. In that moment, the sun slipped behind a veil of clouds, and the soft murmur of distant church bells seemed to toll not just for the departed, but for those still burdened by memories too heavy to speak aloud. The attic at Vale House was a chamber of forgotten echoes. Dust lay thick upon the beams, and the air smelled faintly of mothballs and old paper, a stillness untouched by time but burdened with memory. Miss Marple ascended the narrow staircase with measured steps, her shawl brushing softly against the wood. Letitia followed, carrying a flickering lantern whose light pooled like liquid gold in the dimness. Among trunks swollen with faded linens and cracked leather suitcases, Jane's eyes caught a small, locked box tucked beneath a heap of yellow journals. The lock was rusted but yielded to a gentle twist. Inside lay a bundle of papers, brittle and fragile, wrapped carefully in oilskin. Unfolding them, Miss Marple discovered a manuscript, fragments of a confession, scribbled in a hurried, jagged hand. The ink had faded in places, the edges curling like dry leaves, but the words spoke clearly, a story of regret, shame, and an unfulfilled promise. The writer spoke of debts unpaid, of a darkness hidden beneath the veneer of respectability. He spoke of fear, of love lost, and a return long delayed. Each sentence seemed weighed down with a sorrow that trembled beneath the surface, never fully voiced but always felt. On the last page, under a shaky signature, was a simple sentence: "If you hear the bell, know that I have come home." Letitia exhaled softly, her fingers trembling as she reached to touch the faded script. It's as though the past has reached through the years, trying to speak. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Sometimes, the attic tells us what the lips cannot. Secrets wait patiently in silence, until someone is ready to listen. They remained there a moment longer, the quiet only broken by the faint creak of the old house settling around them. Outside, the wind whispered through the gnarled branches of ancient oaks, carrying the faint toll of a distant bell, soft, uneven, haunting. Jane folded the manuscript carefully, a new understanding blossoming in her chest. The story was no longer just a mystery to solve. It was a plea, a final chapter left unfinished, waiting for a voice to give it meaning. The village stood at the old crossroads where Morton Chase's uneven cobblestones met the twisting country road, framed by ancient oaks whose skeletal branches seemed to reach like pleading hands toward a fading sky. The sign above the door, once bright and proud, now hung askew on a rusted chain, creaking softly in the damp breeze, as if whispering a secret meant only for those who dared to listen. Miss Marple stepped inside with the quiet certainty of one accustomed to reading beyond what was said and what was left unspoken. The warm glow of a low-burning hearth cast flickering shadows across the worn wooden beams, each one etched with the passage of years and countless stories folded into the grain. The murmurs of the inn's usual patrons, tradesmen weary from the day's labor, and pensioners whose eyes held the weight of decades, wove together in a low hum of guarded familiarity. It was a world where words were measured and silence carried its own meaning. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Halsey, the innkeeper's wife, a woman whose sharp eyes had witnessed more than the village confessions offered freely. Her gaze held a softness tempered by years of careful observation, and as she noticed Miss Marple, a faint, knowing smile touched her lips. "She was here," Mrs. Halsey said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, as if the very walls might be listening too closely. A man, tall and solemn, the sort who paid with coins that seemed to carry the weight of the world, stayed but a single night, asked one curious question: "Can the lake be crossed in the thickest fog?" Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly, and her eyes drifted toward the worn ceiling beams, as though the answer might be etched somewhere in the dark timber. "And did he cross?" she asked, voice calm but edged with curiosity. "No one saw him leave," Mrs. Halsey replied, a shadow passing over her face. "But the path to the lake, it still holds the memory of his footsteps, deep in the softened earth, pressed as if someone tried to make sure he would never be forgotten." Thanking the innkeeper's wife, Miss Marple stepped back out into the cool evening air, where the sky was a blanket of heavy gray clouds pressing low over the village. The scent of damp earth and moss hung thick, mingling with the faint, lingering aroma of wood smoke from distant chimneys. The quiet crunch of her boots on the gravel road marked a deliberate pace, each step drawing her nearer to the lake's edge and the secrets it had kept hidden beneath its cold surface. The path wound through a thicket of reeds, their stalks brittle and bent beneath the weight of early frost, whispering softly in the breeze. The low murmur of Windermere Lake came alive here, the water lapping gently against the shore, its voice a mixture of lullaby and lament. It was a place both beautiful and haunted, where stillness held the kind of weight that pressed upon the chest, making the air thick with unspoken grief. There, half buried beneath a tangled knot of reeds and clinging mud, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught sight of something out of place. She knelt down carefully, brushing aside the sodden reeds to reveal the cracked and weather-worn handle of a boat's tiller, its once polished surface now dulled by time and the harshness of countless seasons. The wood was smooth where countless hands must have gripped it, an unintentional record of journeys taken in silence. Her fingers traced the grain reverently, feeling the faint pulse of the past buried beneath the worn surface. This tiller was no mere piece of forgotten wood. It was a symbol of crossings, of movements between worlds, between land and water, between safety and risk, between concealment and revelation. It spoke of promises made in shadow and the fragile hope of redemption that, like the tiller itself, had been cracked but never fully broken. As Miss Marple sat back on her heels, the water whispered a quiet secret. The lake's surface was now an endless expanse of muted gray, reflecting the gathering twilight and the heavy sky above. The reeds swayed like mourners in a slow dirge, and the faintest hint of a chill crept through the air, reminding her that some memories, much like the cold, never fully fade. Pocketing the tiller with care, Miss Marple rose and turned to leave, the last light of the day slipping beneath the horizon as the first stars began to shimmer faintly above the pines. She understood, with that quiet certainty she had long honed, that Windermere Lake held more than water and fog. It held truths submerged beneath stillness, waiting patiently for the right moment, the right person, to set them free. The letter arrived on a gray, damp morning, when even the village seemed reluctant to wake, as if caught in the lingering grip of some restless dream. The postman, an old man with slow, deliberate movements, placed the envelope carefully on the worn oak table in Windermere Hall's dimly lit study. The paper was thick, textured, and folded with the meticulous care of someone unused to haste. No stamp, no return address, only Clarissa's name, penned in an elegant but unfamiliar hand. Clarissa held the letter with trembling fingers, eyes narrowed as she broke the seal. The words inside were few but heavy, each sentence weighted with the ache of years spent apart, the longing for forgiveness, and the hope for a quiet reconciliation. "I rang the bell," the letter began, "not to summon judgment, but to call back what was lost. The manuscript remains with the house, its truth inseparable from these walls. I did not come to your door because I feared the pride that divides us, yet I have always watched, always waited." Miss Marple sat beside her, the faint glow from the fire reflecting in her steady gaze. She read the letter slowly, the soft rustle of paper the only sound in the room aside from the distant call of a lone bird outside. The scent of damp earth and old wood filled the air, wrapping around them like a secret shared in whispered confidence. Clarissa's voice broke the silence at last, quiet but resolute. "He was always the better man, the one I never understood, the one I judged too harshly. I was proud, stubborn, and now I see how little that mattered." Tears gathered and slipped down her cheeks, not of sorrow alone but of release, as if the years of silence had finally found a voice. Miss Marple reached out gently, placing a comforting hand on hers. "In truth, some wounds are not meant to be opened again," Jane said softly, "but neither are they meant to be forgotten. Sometimes the bravest act is to listen, to let the past speak in its own time and in its own way." Outside, the village remained shrouded in mist, the familiar contours of rooftops and trees softened as if painted by memory itself. The bell, once a symbol of absence and loss, now seemed to pulse faintly through the fog, less a summons, more a gentle heartbeat woven into the fabric of the hall. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, her gaze lingering on the swirling mists over Windermere Lake. "Forgiveness," she mused, "is not a door thrown open with abandon, but a key turned quietly, in hope that what lies beyond is not darkness, but peace." Clarissa nodded, the weight on her shoulders lightening with each breath. The letter lay open between them like a bridge spanning years of estrangement, fragile but unbroken. And somewhere, beneath the rolling gray sky and the watching pines, a presence stirred, a quiet acceptance, a lingering grace, that even the longest silence cannot extinguish. The days that followed were wrapped in a slow, deliberate quiet, as if the very air at Windermere Hall had shifted, softened by the unspoken truths now nestled between its ancient walls. The villagers noticed a change too, subtle, like the first fragile thaw after a long winter. Even the lake seemed less somber, its gray surface catching flecks of light beneath the persistent mist. It was on such a morning that a small boat was found, caught quietly in the reeds along the far edge of Windermere Lake. Empty and weathered, its timbers cracked and softened by years of water and silence. The tiller, half buried in mud, was worn smooth as if handled by hands both gentle and familiar. No trace of the man who had come in the night. No hurried footprints, no whispers left behind. Only the boat and the faintest echo of a presence long awaited. Miss Marple stood by the water's edge, the damp chill seeping through her shawl, and she let her gaze drift across the stillness. She thought of the letter, of Clarissa's quiet tears, and the fragile hope that had stirred something buried in them all. Sometimes, she said softly to no one but the wind, closure is not found in the final act, but in the grace of those who remain. Back at Windermere Hall, the bell was restored, not to its old place by the boathouse, but above the heavy oak door of the main hall, where it caught the light and cast slender shadows on the stone. It rang on occasion, though no hand was seen to pull its rope, faint, distant, like a memory waking. Clarissa often paused by the door to listen. It's as if the house itself remembers, she told Miss Marple once, and forgives. Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Homes are not made of walls alone, she said. They are shaped by the stories told within them, by the silences kept, and by the hearts brave enough to hold both. As spring stretched its fingers across the land, the village began to heal its own quiet wounds. The lake's mist lifted, revealing green shoots pushing through the earth, and in time, the shadows that had once seemed so heavy were replaced by a delicate light. When Miss Marple finally left Windermere Hall, she carried no grand verdict or thunderous judgment. Instead, she took with her the knowledge that some mysteries are less about solving and more about understanding. That forgiveness, like the slow bloom of a flower, needs time, and sometimes a bell to call it gently home. The final days at Windermere Hall settled like a soft, deliberate dusk, wrapping the ancient stone walls and overgrown gardens in a quiet stillness that felt almost sacred. The air inside the great drawing room was thick with the weight of unspoken reflections, yet it was not heavy. Rather, it carried a fragile grace, as if the house itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. Miss Marple sat comfortably in her usual chair, the familiar crackle of the fire casting dancing shadows on the high ceiling. Across from her, Clarissa Hargrove, once proud and rigid as the gnarled pines surrounding the estate, now wore a gentler expression. Her eyes, softened by recent revelations and the steady passage of time, lingered on the restored bell above the door, its polished surface catching the firelight and refracting tiny sparks of amber and gold. "It's strange," Clarissa began, her voice low and thoughtful, "how something as simple as a bell can hold so much. For years, it was just a relic, forgotten, ignored, even resented. But now it feels like a guardian, a reminder." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, her eyes meeting Clarissa's with a quiet warmth. Homes are made not only of stone and timber, but of memory and meaning. The bell is no longer just an object. It's become a symbol of grace. It calls not to punish, but to forgive. Clarissa smiled, a small, wistful curve of her lips. "I used to think justice meant punishment, retribution for wrongs done. But it is not justice that this house needed. It was grace, a kind of mercy that heals rather than wounds." Outside, the morning mist was lifting, revealing the shimmering surface of Windermere Lake. The first lark's song pierced the quiet, delicate and hopeful, as if heralding a new chapter not only for the land but for those who lived near it. The village, too, stirred from its slumber, its slow rhythms resuming beneath the awakening sun. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the window, watching the soft light spill across the water and ripple through the reeds. The lake seemed calmer now, its gray mood softened by the clarity of day. "It's curious," she mused softly, "how the past clings to us like shadows, even when we think we have let it go. The bell's toll, faint and distant on foggy mornings, is a reminder that some echoes never truly fade. They live in the silence between words, in the spaces where memories quietly settle." Clarissa looked up at the bell again, as if willing it to speak its own story. "Do you think it will ever stop ringing?" she asked, a trace of vulnerability in her voice. Miss Marple smiled gently, the lines around her eyes deepening with the wisdom of years. "Perhaps not. Some stories need to be heard over and over, not to haunt, but to remind us that healing takes time, that forgiveness, like the slow blooming of a flower after a harsh winter, cannot be rushed, and that peace often arrives not as a triumphant shout, but as a whispered promise." The house, once burdened by secrets and silences, seemed to breathe more freely in that quiet moment, as if the long-hidden sorrows were being lifted, layer by tender layer. Miss Marple rose slowly, the familiar weight of her shawl comforting against the cool air. She paused by the door, her fingers lightly brushing the bell's smooth surface. It was no longer merely an object, but a testament to resilience, a bridge between past and present. As she stepped outside, the sun warmed her face, and the scent of damp earth and budding flowers filled the air. The village was alive once more, but it carried with it a gentleness born from understanding. In her heart, Miss Marple carried the knowledge that not all mysteries end with neat solutions or dramatic revelations. Sometimes the greatest truths unfold like the pages of a well-loved book, slowly, quietly, with shadows and light entwined. And so, as she walked away from Wintermere Hall, the bell's faint toll echoed softly behind her, a reminder that some homes and some hearts never truly close, but instead hold open a space for grace, for remembrance, and for the slow, steady unfolding of peace.